John walked into the small, cozy restaurant with his service dog, Max, by his side. It was just another day for them, another quiet dinner at a place they'd been to before. Max, a calm and well-trained German shepherd, stayed close, his eyes alert but gentle as always. John could feel the usual stares from some of the other diners as he made his way to an empty booth in the corner. He had gotten used to it over the years. People didn't always understand service dogs, and sometimes that led to awkward looks and whispered comments. As John settled into his seat, Max curled up next to him on the floor. The low hum of conversation filled the restaurant, and John took a moment to relax. He had served in the military for over a decade before retiring, and Max had been with him for the past few years. The dog wasn't just a companion, he was a lifeline, helping John manage the everyday challenges that came with post-traumatic stress disorder. John wasn't expecting anything special from this visit, just a quiet meal to unwind. But as he scanned the menu, he noticed a woman at the counter staring at Max with a curious, almost judgmental look. Soon, the waitress approached their table. She was friendly enough, but there was a slight hesitation in her step. "Hi, welcome. Can I take your order?" she asked, glancing briefly at Max, who was sitting calmly at John's feet. John nodded and gave his usual polite greeting. "Thanks, just water for now." She hesitated, eyes flicking back to Max, then back to John. Is your dog a service animal?" she asked, her voice soft but unsure. John's heart sank a little. It wasn't an unusual question, but it was one he was tired of answering. "Yes, he's a service dog," John replied, keeping his tone calm. "He helps me manage my PTSD. We're good to stay here." He gave her a reassuring smile, hoping it would ease the tension. The waitress nodded but still seemed unsure. She was about to speak when a voice from a nearby table cut through the air. "Hey, you can't bring a dog in here," the man said loudly, looking directly at John and Max. His voice was harsh, and he didn't seem to care who heard. "It's a health violation. You're not allowed to have pets in the restaurant." John felt the eyes of everyone around them shift toward the table. He stayed quiet, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. "He's a service dog," John said firmly, trying to keep his cool. He had dealt with similar situations before, but this man wasn't backing down. Instead, he crossed his arms and glared at John. "Yeah, right. I've heard that excuse before," the man shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is a restaurant, not a petting zoo. You can't just bring any dog in here." The room grew still as the argument continued. People exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene. John could feel the anger starting to rise inside him, but he focused on Max, who remained perfectly still, his eyes calm. John's grip tightened on the table, but he refused to let the situation escalate. The tension in the restaurant grew thicker as the man's words hung in the air. John could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he fought to keep his composure. Max, who was always so calm, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The dog's ears perked up slightly, but he didn't move from John's side. John looked at the man, trying to stay calm. "He's a service dog," John repeated, his voice steady but firm. "He's here to help me. I'm not asking for special treatment, just the right to have a meal." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, please. That's just an excuse," he said, his tone full of disbelief. "No dog should be in a restaurant. It's against the rules. I'm telling you, you need to get that animal out of here." John's grip on the table tightened, but he kept his cool. He'd been through much worse situations in the past, and he wasn't going to let this man ruin his evening. The restaurant grew quieter. A few patrons looked over, some clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others seemed more interested in what was happening. John knew the rules. Service dogs were allowed in public spaces, especially places like restaurants, as long as they were trained to help their owners. He wasn't breaking any laws, but the man wasn't listening. Instead, he stood up and took a few steps closer to John's table. "I don't care about your excuses," he said, his voice rising. "You can't have a dog in here. I'm calling the manager." John looked around at the other customers, noticing the mixed reactions. Some were trying to act like they weren't paying attention, while others were clearly watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. The waitress, who had been standing by quietly, finally spoke up. "Sir, I'll go get the manager," she said, looking at John apologetically before hurrying toward the back. The man smirked, clearly thinking he'd won. John remained silent, his eyes fixed on Max, who was still perfectly still beside him. Just as the waitress disappeared into the back, John saw the restaurant manager approach. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, and he looked like he was trying to keep the situation under control. "What seems to be the problem here?" the manager asked, his eyes flicking from John to the man causing the disturbance. John spoke calmly, explaining that Max was a service dog and that they had every right to be there. The man didn't like that response. "This is a health code violation," he shouted again, pointing at Max. "You can't allow that dog in here. I won't eat in a place that allows this." The manager looked between the two men, clearly unsure of what to do. John could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. All he wanted was a peaceful meal, but now it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. John knew he couldn't back down, not just for himself, but for anyone else who had been in this position before. He wasn't going to let some rude customer dictate what he could or couldn't do. But the tension was thick, and he could tell the manager was on the edge of making a decision that could change everything. The manager hesitated for a moment, looking at John, then at the man who was still standing, his arms crossed defiantly. John could feel his heart beating faster, the stress of the situation creeping up on him. Max, ever the calm presence, remained sitting by his side, his tail gently tapping the floor. John took a deep breath, trying to stay focused. He knew his rights, but right now, it didn't feel like that mattered. The manager looked torn, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Sir," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "I'm sorry for the confusion, but we do have to follow health codes. No dogs allowed in the dining area unless they're service animals." The man snorted, clearly not convinced. "Yeah, sure, and I'm supposed to just take his word for it." He shot a pointed look at John. "How do we know that dog's actually a service animal? Looks like any other dog to me." John felt his jaw tighten. He had been through this too many times before. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted the legitimacy of Max's service. It wasn't even the first time someone had tried to make a scene. But it was still frustrating, and tonight, he could feel his patience wearing thin. "He's a service dog," John said again, his voice steady but firm. "He's been trained to help me. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to eat my dinner." The manager glanced at the man again, then at Max, who was sitting patiently, looking up at John with those calm, trusting eyes. "Sir, I understand," the manager said slowly, "but we do have to consider the other customers. If there's an issue with a dog in the restaurant, I have to address it." The man, clearly feeling victorious, took a few steps back, his chest puffed out. "Exactly. You can't just let anyone bring in a dog. There are rules for a reason." Just then, John felt a shift in the room. The door to the restaurant opened, and a group of men walked in, their voices low but confident. At first, John didn't pay them much attention, but then he noticed the way they moved, purposefully, with a calm authority that made the atmosphere in the room change instantly. The group of men, all wearing military-style jackets, walked past the counter, and one of them caught sight of the commotion at John's table. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked over at the situation, and he exchanged a brief glance with the others in his group. Without a word, one of the men, a tall figure with a buzz cut, walked toward John's table. He had an air of someone used to being in charge. "Is everything okay here?" he asked in a deep, steady voice. His gaze was now focused on the man who had been causing the trouble. The man paused, caught off guard by the sudden attention, but quickly tried to recover. "This guy's got a dog in here," he said, pointing at John. "It's a health code violation. He shouldn't be allowed to have that dog." The Marine's expression didn't change. He looked down at John, then back at the man who had been complaining. "This man served his country," the Marine said, his voice low but full of authority. "And that's a service dog. You don't get to question that." The room went silent as the words hung in the air. John could feel a wave of relief wash over him. Someone was finally stepping in. The Marine turned to the manager, who seemed almost grateful for the interruption. The man who had caused the disruption looked embarrassed, but he didn't back down. The tension was palpable, and John could feel the pressure easing, just a little bit, with every word spoken. The Marine stood tall, his presence commanding attention, and the room seemed to freeze in place. John could feel the shift. The once tense atmosphere now held a quiet weight, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The man who had been causing the trouble shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening as the Marine's words hung in the air. "This man served his country," the Marine repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And that's a service dog. You don't get to question that." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the words settled. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The other patrons, who had been whispering under their breath and stealing glances, now sat still watching. John felt a wave of gratitude for the unexpected support, and a sense of calm washed over him, like someone had finally stepped in to shield him from the storm. Max, who had been silently watching the exchange, remained perfectly still by John's side. The man who had started the conflict stood there, now clearly unsure of what to do. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He glanced at the manager, who looked equally uncertain, caught between the man's complaints and the Marine's unwavering stance. After a long, awkward pause, the man grumbled something unintelligible and turned back to his table, clearly defeated. The Marine didn't take his eyes off him, as if making sure the man understood the situation. When he finally turned back to John, his expression softened slightly. "You good, man?" he asked, his voice much more relaxed now. John nodded, feeling a small but real sense of relief. "Yeah, thanks," John replied, his voice quiet but sincere. "I really appreciate it." The Marine gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. "No problem," he said simply, then turned and walked back to his group. The other Marines followed him, their eyes still scanning the room, making sure everything was okay. John could feel the tension in the room slowly fading as the group settled in at their own table, but he knew that the atmosphere had changed. It was as if the whole place had collectively let out a sigh of relief. The manager, who had been standing in the background, now stepped forward, his expression softer. He looked at John and then at Max, his voice less formal. "I'm really sorry about all this, sir," he said. "There won't be any more problems. You and your dog are always welcome here." John nodded again, appreciating the manager's change of heart. He hadn't expected that kind of apology, and it made him feel a little better about the whole ordeal. The man who had caused the trouble didn't say another word. He seemed to shrink into himself, embarrassed by the way things had played out. John felt a flicker of something. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a quiet victory. It wasn't just about winning the argument. It was about standing up for what was right, not letting others decide your worth based on their ignorance. As the evening continued, John and Max resumed their meal. The conversation in the restaurant slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the confrontation lingered. John couldn't help but think about how sometimes it took a stranger to remind people of the importance of respect. And in this case, that stranger had worn the uniform of a Marine. Just as things started to settle, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted once again. The group of Marines who had caused the tension to dissolve moments earlier were now sitting at their table, quietly enjoying their meal. The silence from the earlier confrontation hung in the air, but the unease had been replaced by a subtle sense of respect. John could still feel the weight of the moment, but now it was lighter, like the air was finally clearing. He took a deep breath and focused on his meal, trying to block out the remnants of the drama that had unfolded. Max, his loyal companion, lay peacefully by his feet, his eyes half closed as he rested. John smiled softly, scratching Max behind the ears. The dog's presence was a steady comfort, a reminder that no matter how strange or difficult the world could be, Max was always there, calm and unshakable. John had learned a lot from Max over the years, how to stay grounded, how to stay calm in moments of chaos. Tonight, it had been Max's calmness that had kept him centered, even when everything around him seemed ready to boil over. Just as John was about to take another bite of his food, he felt someone approach. It was the Marine who had spoken up earlier, the one who had stood tall and quiet in the middle of the tension. He was walking over to John's table, a slight grin on his face. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked, his voice friendly but strong. John looked up, surprised but not bothered. Of course, he replied with a nod, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. The Marine pulled the chair out and sat down, glancing over at Max with a small smile. He's a good dog, the Marine said, his tone lighter now. I've seen a lot of service dogs, but this guy looks like he knows exactly what he's doing. John chuckled softly, feeling a small spark of pride. Yeah, he's the best, John said. He's helped me more than I can explain. It's not just about the training. It's about the bond, you know? The Marine nodded, his expression serious but understanding. I get it. I've seen how much they can change a person's life. I'm glad you've got him. There was a pause as they both took in the moment, the noise of the restaurant humming quietly in the background. John couldn't help but feel grateful for the simple act of kindness. He had expected to be alone in this situation, to face the discomfort on his own. But here was a stranger, a Marine no less, showing him understanding. You know, the Marine continued after a moment, it's rare to see someone stand up for what they believe in like that. You didn't back down when that guy was causing trouble. A lot of people would have just let it slide. John shrugged, not wanting to make too much of it. It's just how it is. People don't always understand. But you don't let them push you around, especially when you know you're right. The Marine smiled again, a knowing look in his eyes. Yeah, I respect that. There was a long pause before the Marine stood up to leave, but before he walked away, he gave John a firm handshake. You take care, all right? Stay strong. And keep that dog by your side. He's doing good work. John felt the weight of the handshake, the sincerity behind it. Thanks, I will, John replied, watching as the Marine returned to his table. As John watched the group of Marines settle back into their meal, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of appreciation. Tonight, he had walked into that restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, but what he got was a reminder that sometimes support could come from the most unexpected places. And just like that, the conflict was forgotten, replaced by an unspoken understanding that respect and kindness could go a long way. As John took another bite of his meal, he felt the quiet hum of the restaurant around him. The tension had dissipated, but the emotions from earlier still lingered in his mind. The incident had shaken him more than he expected. He wasn't someone who liked to draw attention to himself or make a scene. But sometimes, when faced with ignorance, standing up was the only choice. Tonight, he had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for Max, who had always been by his side, and for everyone who had ever been in a similar situation. He glanced down at Max, who was now stretched out on the floor beside him, his eyes closed in contentment. The dog had always been a source of strength for John. Max had helped him through dark times, times when it felt like the world was too heavy to bear. He had been there when John returned from deployment, and he had been there through every struggle, every sleepless night. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline. As John finished his meal, the restaurant continued to bustle around him. It felt almost surreal now, like the earlier confrontation had happened in another world. But John knew it wasn't just about the argument. It was about something deeper, the need for people to understand the challenges that veterans and service animals face every day. John had learned over time that education was key, and sometimes standing up for yourself was the only way to make that happen. He glanced over at the table where the group of Marines had settled in. They were eating and talking among themselves, but John couldn't help but feel a connection to them. There was something comforting in knowing that, even in a place where things had gone sideways, there were people who understood. Maybe it was the shared experiences of serving in the military, or maybe it was just the simple act of standing up for what was right. Either way, John felt less alone, and that was something he hadn't expected. As John stood up to pay for his meal, he noticed that the restaurant was quieter than it had been when he first walked in. The earlier tension seemed to have dissolved entirely, leaving behind a peaceful stillness. The manager, who had been on edge during the confrontation, now greeted John with a friendly smile. "Thank you for your patience," the manager said, his voice sincere. "I hope the rest of your evening is better." John nodded, appreciating the change in tone. "Thanks. I just wanted a quiet dinner, that's all." As he walked toward the door, Max following close behind, John felt a sense of closure. The night hadn't gone as planned, but it had ended in a way that felt right. He had faced a challenge head-on and come out the other side stronger, with a reminder that there were people out there who cared, who understood. As John opened the door to leave, the cool evening air greeted him, and he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Sometimes the world needed a reminder that kindness and respect should come first, and tonight he had been part of making that happen. As John and Max stepped into the night, John couldn't help but smile. The night had been difficult, but it had also reminded him of the importance of standing up for what's right. And with Max by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. As John and Max stepped out of the restaurant, the cool night air felt refreshing against his skin. The street outside was quieter now, the usual hum of traffic softened by the calm of the late evening. Max trotted happily beside him, his tail wagging gently as they walked down the sidewalk. John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day finally start to lift. The confrontation at the restaurant had been a lot more draining than he had anticipated, but now, with Max by his side, everything felt manageable again. The night sky above was clear, the stars faint but still visible in the dark. John didn't usually think about the stars, but tonight they seemed to offer a sense of calm. As he walked, he thought about the events that had just unfolded, the rude man, the tension in the air, and how quickly everything had shifted when the Marines stepped in. He hadn't expected any of it, but he was grateful for the support. It had reminded him that not all people would stand idly by in the face of unfairness. Sometimes, help came from the most unexpected places. John paused for a moment, looking down at Max. The dog, sensing the break in their walk, sat down beside him and looked up, his eyes full of trust. "You're something else, buddy," John muttered softly, scratching behind Max's ears. "I don't know how I'd do it without you." Max let out a soft sigh, leaning into John's touch. He didn't need to say anything. Max had been his silent supporter, always there when needed, never judging, always understanding. As they continued walking, John's thoughts turned to the broader picture. How often people like him, veterans with service dogs, found themselves having to explain themselves. It wasn't something he liked talking about, but it was a reality that he couldn't avoid. He knew the rules. Service dogs were allowed in public spaces. They weren't pets. They were helpers, lifelines for those who needed them. But still, the misunderstanding and ignorance were everywhere. Tonight had been another reminder of that. John knew he wasn't the only one facing these challenges. There were plenty of veterans out there, just like him, struggling to be understood. As John walked further down the street, his steps slower now, he reflected on how the support he'd gotten tonight had made all the difference. The Marines had stood up for him, without hesitation, without question. In a world where people often turned away from uncomfortable situations, those few Marines had done what many others wouldn't. They'd taken the time to recognize the truth, to offer solidarity when it was most needed. John couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for them, but for himself. He had stood up for what was right, and that had made a difference. As they neared the park at the end of the street, John looked down at Max once more. The dog was now walking beside him, content and steady as always. John's heart swelled with gratitude. No matter the challenges, no matter the ignorance, he knew he had Max. And with Max by his side, he felt like he could take on anything, even the difficult days when the world seemed a little too harsh. Tonight had been hard, but it had also shown him that sometimes support came when he least expected it, from both the people around him and the dog who was always by his side. John smiled softly as he opened the gate to the park. "Let's get some air, buddy," he said to Max, who wagged his tail in response. The night was still young, and for now, everything felt just right. As John and Max entered the park, the quiet night air seemed to wrap around them like a soft blanket. The streets had been busy before, but here, everything felt peaceful. The trees stood tall, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze, and the dim lights along the path cast soft shadows on the ground. John let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening lift with each step. The confrontation at the restaurant felt like it was slowly fading, but the sense of relief was still fresh, like a calm after a storm. Max trotted ahead, his nose twitching as he explored the familiar smells of the park. John watched him for a moment, a small smile tugging at his lips. Max had always been a calming presence, no matter what kind of day John had. Whether it was a rough day at work or a challenging interaction with strangers, Max was always there, his steady and quiet nature a reminder of what really mattered. The bond between them was unspoken, but it ran deep, a bond built on trust, patience, and years of shared experiences. As they walked along the path, John's thoughts returned to the events earlier. The man at the restaurant had pushed him, and for a moment he felt cornered. But the Marines had stepped in, offering the kind of support that John hadn't expected. Their quick action had made all the difference, and John realized just how much he needed that reminder, that sometimes people would stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. It was a rare thing, but it was powerful when it happened. John thought about how many times he'd had to explain to others about Max, about what it meant to have a service dog. Most people didn't get it. They saw a dog, and they thought it was just like any other. They didn't understand the training, the work, the sacrifices. They didn't know that Max was there to help him through difficult moments, to help him face the world in ways that would have been impossible without him. John knew that ignorance was a part of life, but that didn't mean it didn't sting when people assumed the worst. As Max paused by a bench to take a rest, John sat down beside him, the cool metal of the bench offering the welcome change from the warm evening air. He looked around the park, taking in the stillness of the night. It was moments like this that reminded him of why he fought so hard for respect, for understanding. It wasn't just about the service dog or the rules. It was about people recognizing the value of what veterans and their animals went through. It was about showing kindness when it mattered, about standing up for what was right when no one else would. Max sat beside him, resting his head on John's knee. John reached down, giving the dog that gentle scratch behind the ears. "You know, buddy," John whispered, "you're my hero." Max looked up at him, those trusting eyes meeting his, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Tonight had been a reminder that even in a world full of uncertainty, there was always a reason to keep going. And with Max by his side, John knew he was never alone in facing whatever came next. Together, they could handle anything.